This evening is a celebration of the publication of Andrew Benjamin's architectural philosophy. And it's with kind of very great pleasure that we're not welcoming him here, but celebrating the publication of the book with him here. He still goes under the wonderful title of Visiting Architectural Critic at the AA, which of course distinguishes it from all those who aren't visiting and won't go away, all those who should be here but haven't. It's also the case that I think Bob Maxwell, sitting in the front row, is the only person, if as it were, he was responsible for employing New Zealand's gift to architectural theory at Princeton in the form of Mark Wigley. He's now able to work with Australia's gift to architectural theory, Andrew Benjamin. And we have our own New Zealander, of course, in the form of Hélène Ferjane. By now, Andrew has become our visiting critic, and it's with irritation that I read that he's occasionally also contributed to Columbia University, and indeed has a job at the University of Warwick, where he is not only Professor of Philosophy, but Director of the Centre for Research in Philosophy and Literature, that is, at the University of Warwick. We know him as an extremely kind of perspicacious critic, and one for which not all philosophers kind of fulfill that role. It's frequently, I've noticed, the task of philosophers in architectural departments to in some way kind of dignify the profession of architecture. And one of the most lamentable features, I think, about architects is that quite often they quite like that kind of dignification when it comes from the inside. There are, I think, very few people in the philosophical field who enter in such detail and with such intuitive comprehension into the complex of concepts and works which contemporary architectural practitioners engage in, so that they are brought, as it were, to a more self-conscious understanding of what they do. And I think Andrew has really a unique capacity to bring about this self-consciousness through reflection upon actual architectural projects and work, and is, as far as possible, someone who comes from a noble exterior called philosophy in order to kind of induct philosophers, in order to induct architects into the nature of truth. So it's with very great pleasure that he's not only going to be here with us this evening to celebrate the publication of the book, Architectural Philosophy, a celebration which will continue upstairs after the lecture, but with his characteristic generosity is also actually going to present an argument on the relationship between drawing and diagram, albeit in a somewhat historical form, as I suppose a taster to the course that he's going to give next term on drawing and diagrams. As always, it's an enormous pleasure to welcome Andrew.
Thank you very much. It really is an enormous pleasure to be here and do things here. And as I said in the book, that partly because I had to be nice to Columbia, I said that the book is really a tale of two institutions. And for me, it's true. If it weren't for the generosity of Mark and Moisen here and Bernard in the past at Columbia, I wouldn't have had the chance to do what I do. So I am also extremely grateful for the opportunity. What I'm going to do tonight is read a lecture which is perhaps philosophical in the pejorative sense of the term, i.e. not particularly interesting. But what I want to do is what I've been trying to do with the little book I've just finishing on the surface, and that is to present, I suppose, what one could call a type of history. It's a type of history because I'm not a historian. But what interests me is always the project of robbing the present of its novelty by retroactively creating a history for it. And in regard to the surface, it struck me that a line drawn from Zempa through Loos, to a certain extent through Rowan Slutsky, up into concerns with topology, or one of my dear friends calls wobbly surface people, gives you a history of the present that robs the present of novelty. And that project in some sense is not complete, but it's complete for me in that it's now almost written up. So I decided what I wanted to do was to try and, what price hubris, what I wanted to try and do is do the same sort of thing for lines and diagrams. And this is a first attempt. It figures, if you like, a debate that takes place at the end of the 17th century, early part of the 18th century, though Hegel does appear, I'm afraid, in order to try and show that the analogy with machines and automata actually, and the debates between Descartes and Fontenelle on one side and Leibniz on the other, actually gives us some of the real issues at work in trying to understand theoretically the question of diagrams and the question of what is a line when it's not representational, but it contains the capacity to be representational, but it's not to be viewed from the very beginning as a representation. And that's the project, is how to think lines and points. And so what I'm going to do now is read you part of this project, which involves going back through old texts, really to stage them again in order to allow for this moment, if you like, of a type of history to be worked through. There are no illustrations, it's just words. Let me begin then. What is a line? How are lines to be drawn? It should not be thought that the history of philosophy has remained unaware of such questions, as though the drawing of a line could not be drawn through philosophy. Moreover, whatever can be said of the line can be said of the point. The line and the point draw geometry into philosophy. Equally, once geometry has allowed its place within the philosophical, it begins to carve out a space and a position that works as a fundamental site of relation. There is a certain historical familiarity here. And yet in this instance, what is of concern is not just the presence of these themes within early modern philosophy, nor of their staging in sections 254 to 262 of Hegel's Philosophy of Nature, a staging the significance of which will need to be taken up in the context of this lecture, but what is then opened up as the concerns of representation within philosophy and the appropriate designation of the diagram within architecture. The space within philosophy, the space given by the now intrusive presence of geometry, define a setup that is reducible to neither and yet refer to both. A return will need to be made to this space, a return in which it has to be named as architectural theory, and a space and with it a line needs to be drawn. The question returns, how does a line come to be drawn? Responding to this question does not necessitate a detour. On the contrary, it involves re-articulating a tradition and thus perhaps rewriting, albeit for the first time, a certain history in order that the question of the line and thus the drawing of models constructed of lines, can be seen as figuring in the space opened up by the interplay of geometry and philosophy. The history in question begins with a particular historical preoccupation. Descartes, Fontenelle, Leibniz advance philosophical arguments in terms of a series of analogies with machines. And yet this is not sufficient, since the specific concern that Fontenelle, writing at the end of the 17th century, will have in his critical engagement with Leibniz, an engagement that is repeated by Condillac in the middle of the 18th century, in his own monadology, concerns that relationship between a conception of the infinite and the relationship between unity and parts. Within this history, what figures are the problems of drawing and of representing, and thus of what status to be attributed to drawings and to that which we too quickly call representations. If parts of an assemblage are all present at once, then the presentation of the constitutive elements has to be defined by temporal simultaneity, either assumed or noted, such that not only does time, rather than space, come to define the presentation of the constitutive elements, simultaneity provides the temporality of representation. In other words, representation is a particular formulation of time. And to me this is a tremendously important point, in that we rush too quickly to space and to a preoccupation with space, as though spatiality were an end in itself. It seems to me that spatiality always has its conditions of possibility, a certain understanding of time. If all lines interconnect and present one thing at one and the same moment, then what makes that possible is what I'm calling a temporality of the instant, i.e. all things pertain at this point in time now. The time of the now, a version of the instant, becomes the condition for the possibility of representation. As will emerge, the problems that arise within the writings of Leibniz for the interplay of representation and its necessary interarticulation within a temporality of the instant will work to redefine the possibility of drawing. Within that redefinition, the drawing of a line and the placing of a point will have opened up the very complexity that is refused by representation as a mode of philosophical practice, and as that which determines the practice of interpretation. More importantly, the effect of the refusal of the centrality of representation repositions lines, points, and thus drawing, such that representation reappears and is able to reappear as an inevitable after-effect of an original drawing marked by that founding complexity. And again, if you look at the history of drawing, if you look at that canonical moment that everyone writes about in Pliny the Elder, it's not every day you get to say Pliny the Elder, so I'll say it again, in Pliny the Elder, in which the history of drawing is announced, where the lover sketches the outline of her man as he goes off to battle. Painting begins with a representation of that which is not there. And that determines, in some sense, how we understand drawing, as preconditioned by, as it were, the melancholic space of absence, opened up by an initial representation. And what interests me is providing another way of construing drawing. Instead of saying it marks that which is not there, and therefore is always a representation, what would it be like to reposition drawing, and therefore the drawing of a line? And in a sense that is part what is fueling the project. Having developed the problematic presence of machines and assemblages within the work of Descartes and Fontenelle, a development, I assure you, only an outline, it will be via Hegel's philosophy of nature that the force of Leibniz's own concerns with the assemblage can be stated. As will be argued, it is in the harsh juxtaposition of Hegel's formulation of the line-point relation with Leibniz's presentation of the point in his texts, the principles of nature and of grace, and a treatment of the point, the machine, and the assemblage in other texts by Leibniz. It's with this that the possibility of giving representation a basis, where that basis is what I would want to call an original multiplicity, will emerge. Within such a setup, representation will always be an after effect. Its materiality will have been conditioned by an ineliminable immaterial presence, So the condition for materiality, the materiality of the line, is a necessary immateriality that it brings with it. Moreover, the realization of that possibility will occasion both a reworking of the machine and equally another understanding of the point, and its incorporation of lines that are already drawn. So part one is called Machines and Assemblages. And also the other sort of implicit, more philosophical project here is the attempt to recover a philosophical materialist tradition from the writings of 17th and 18th century French philosophy. And so you will hear that in what I'm saying. One of the elements that opens up the possibility of a materialist philosophical system is the analogy with the machine. In the writings of Descartes, the machine is the human, or at the very least, the human without the rational soul. In Fontenelle's Entretien sur la pluralité des mondes, or Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, the machine is nature. Here the central concerns of the analogy with the machine need to be stated briefly. The point of the enterprise is to identify the way the machine is formulated. In other words, merely evoking machines is not sufficient. I mean, that it happens from Donna Haraway back to Descartes. So the evoking of a machine is not on its own sufficient. What is of interest is the particular formulation given to the machine. Descartes pursues the question of the body as machine, throughout his writings. In his text, The Treatise on Man, he is able to suppose that the body, and I quote, is nothing other than a statue or a machine of earth. Much later in a text he writes towards the end of his life called Les Passions de l'âme, Passions of the Soul. In distinguishing between the body and the soul, and in accounting for the death of the body, he is able to write of the body that, and I quote, death never happens because of a fault of the soul, but only because some principal parts of the body have become corrupted. It's wonderful. And he goes on in this passage to look at an analogy between the human, l'homme, and the automaton, and the watch, and simply to show that what marks out the human body, the watch, the automaton, is that they contain within them their capacity for their own death. In other words, that their principle of activity is located within them, such that their demise is that they, and I quote, they cease to act. For Descartes, two elements have to be noted. The first is that the body, the machine, is always given in opposition to the soul. However, and this is the interesting part, that in addition to the body, there are what Descartes identifies as the animal spirits, les esprits animaux. They are of the body and integral to any account of the causation of bodily movement. Not only are they spirits because they animate the body, they have to be thoroughly distinguished from the soul. So there's not simply the parts of the body and the soul, there's something animating the body that's of a physical nature, that while materially present, has a certain, I'll come on to this, a certain immateriality. These animal spirits, for Descartes, are extremely small, and thus could not be identified by the senses. So they can't be seen, and nonetheless they're still part of the body. They are, to use a wonderful image Descartes has, they are the flicker of the flame within a torch, a flaming torch. The Cartesian body machine is characterized both in its life and in the cessation of that life, death, by the operation of an internal system of movement. Accounting for that movement necessitates recourse to elements other than the moving elements of the body, the moving elements themselves, though not to that which is external to the body, so the machine is maintained. These elements, what has already been identified as the animal spirits, do not have a status that is distinguished on the level of quality from the operation of the body itself. Standing in contradistinction to both the body and the animal spirits is the soul. It should be noted that the recovery of an implicit materialism in Descartes would have to focus on the interplay of these spirits and bodily activity. What then of this machine, this body? And thus what type of materialism is in fact at work in Descartes? The question pertains as much to the nature of the machine as to the possibility of its being represented. Descartes' development of an optics, a development resulting in 1632 in his work La Dioptique, contains illustrations in which not only are the anatomical details of the eye provided, the process of vision is represented. In his work The Passions of the Soul, the movement between the eye and the brain, as well as any understanding of the nature of the images, involves a description in which the operation of these spirits, these animating elements, comes to be essential. These animating principles have different strengths and operate in different ways. In the illustrations from La Dioptique, it is clear that their differing fields of activity can be assumed to have been marked out by the drawing of a line from the external world to the internal world, from the image through the eye, and it's inverted on the retina, and that these lines are drawn in the text. These lines, whilst not movement itself, trace the introduction of light into the eye, and, in addition, the transformation of the external source into an internal image. The drawn line is the drawing in of the external world. Affecting this movement, realizing it, are the animal spirits, whose activity could always be noted, a notation understood as a form of representation, by the addition of arrows indicating movement. The presence of the soul, however, cannot be drawn. There cannot be a line from the external world to the internal, leading to the soul. Descartes' retention of the pineal gland, both as the source of the animal spirits and as the point where the body and soul connect, was in fact illustrated. The gland became a point at which the process of representation encountered its negative moment, namely that which cannot be represented. The space opened by the presence of the pineal gland, the space giving on to the soul, is refused presence because the line of representation cannot be drawn into it. The divide between the body and the soul mirrors the divide between the human and God. However, it would be a failure to understand the relationship and therefore the nature of the divide if it were constructed as the mere expression of the distinction between the finite, the world of external objects, the world of drawing, and the infinite. While such a terminology is to a certain degree accurate, it has only real philosophical acuity if finitude, in the Descartes sense, becomes identified with representation and representability, and therefore, and necessarily, with temporal simultaneity. Within this setup, finitude is not given in terms of a process in which the simple and the multiple are interrelated, such that the singular contains, and thus is, a virtual multiplicity, such that finitude is defined as a specific play of forces at a given time, as we'll see in Leibniz. On the contrary, finitude is the simple unity, such that the complex is always an assemblage of parts, and thus a line is always the interconnection of simple points. The question of the machine in Descartes, and thus the presence of a Cartesian materialism, involves working through the relationship between representation, temporal simultaneity, and the effective presence of the animal spirits. The significance of the latter, these animal spirits, is that they open up the space in which there is a move away from a domain of simples to a mechanics by the incorporation of a certain immateriality, namely these animal spirits, to account for its operation. The problem that a Cartesian materialism will always have is not found in these presence of these spirits, nor moreover in the retention of immateriality, since immateriality in general will emerge as that which provides materiality in the first place. Rather, what problems there are can be found in a description of the line, and thus of the drawing of a line, which cannot of itself incorporate a distinction between the material and the immaterial, And the reason why is that the line is thought and positioned within the structure of representation. In Descartes' La dioptique, the drawing of lines is given a specific site. They are drawn in and through the eye. While an optics is constrained to include the eye, constrained moreover to include the drawn presentation of the eye and its field of operation, the representations of vision figure within the simultaneity demanded by the temporality of representation, and, as significantly with Descartes' conception of the singularity of what he calls the object of clear and distinct perception. While this form of perception, this clear and distinct perception, needs to be distinguished from the object of physical seeing, mere sight, both are connected in that both demand the original simplicity of the object. The process of clear and distinct perception, which is the process of Cartesian epistemology, Descartes' theory of knowledge, if you like, is the movement of individuation in which complexity is effaced in order that the original unity and hence simplicity of the object be discovered. When Descartes argues, as he does in a number of places, that the idea of the sun is the sun existing in the understanding, the coextensivity between the idea and that of which the idea is not only the expression of a foundational relationship defined by temporal simultaneity, positioning time as that which determined representation. Again, time determines representation. What is assumed within the operation is the unity of the object. And that unity of the object must be present as an actual unity, present as simplicity as itself, present in simplicita. At this stage, it is essential to return to the formulation given in Descartes' text, The Passions of the Soul. The analogy of the body with the watch, the ticking of the watch, needs to be incorporated into the implicit optics the formulation demands. The watch contains the source of its own movement. The winding of the watch introduces an energy which dissipates over time, and when gone, the watch ceases to work. The watch can be observed running, and thus running down. Its activity, and here activity, is not only defines the interrelationship of parts, each part is defined in terms of that relationship. Moreover, the watch as a totality of interrelated parts defines each part as a simple element of the whole. And in this you can begin to picture a certain understanding of architectural diagrams, of drawings within architecture. Its moreover, the watch as a totality of interrelated parts defines each part as a simple element of the whole. In addition, all the elements are at work at once. In principle, therefore, all the elements, the parts, their relationship, which is the activity of the watch, are given and present at one and the same time. There is no potential in the watch other than that which is already given. There is no possibility of a site of experimentation. The time in which they are given is, as I've said, the temporality of the instant. Given to the eye, they combine as an assemblage, the representation of which involves the drawing of lines that would interconnect, and in so doing would represent the relation of simple parts, of point to point to point. From watch to automaton to body, the differences between them vanish when what is demanded is their representation. All three have a bodily principle of movement. There is no real relationship to immateriality. Rather, all that takes place is the evocation of parts, animal spirits, that are in the end merely that which is so small they cannot be seen. There is not, therefore, a shift on the level of quality. The consequence is that Cartesian materialism opens up a series of possibilities that it has, in the end, to deny. Not because of the introduction of the soul, that would be too easy, but because of a philosophical and hence theoretical inability to think as different that which is present, the operation of parts, and that which, while not present as such, determines the nature of presence. In Cartesian mechanics, there is no space between the body and the soul for a productive immateriality. The sign of that refusal is the interplay of simplicity, time, and representation. It is the absence of a true immateriality that in the end effaces the material. The machine is no more, therefore, than an already delineated field of activity. It is a field of description. The lines preclude experimentation. They can only ever present themselves. Only with the potential offered, I will suggest, in Leibniz's critique of the assemblage, will it be possible to return to the line, and hence the drawing, as the site of experimentation. I now move to a discussion of Fontenelle, and which we will see a version of the same problem. In Fontenelle, the machine reappears, though this time as nature. Fontenelle is no mere empiricist. While resistant to the move that involves the positioning of spirits, he will need to account for the operation of what cannot be seen. And this is what perplexes materialist philosophy. How do you account for the presence of that which cannot be seen when it is clear that that which cannot be seen has a determining effect on what there is? How does materialist philosophy deal with that problem? This is what in late 17th century, early 18th century French philosophy, a whole group of philosophers are driven, as it were, by this particular problem. And it's the inadequacy of their answers which takes one a stage further. The important question guiding any interpretation of the machine of nature in Fontenelle must concern the quality of the difference between what appears and what does not. In other words, how do we understand this distinction? How is the difference thought? This is the key question. How, moreover, is such a difference itself conditioned? Difference on its own is never sufficient. The interpretive question is how such differences are thought. Now, a number of passages from the opening of this text, the Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, are central in order to develop these questions. The first establishes the relationship between nature and the machine. I quote, "Nature is a grand spectacle which resembles that of opera, or going to the opera. From the place where you are at the opera, you do not see the theatre tout à fait comme il est, absolutely as it is, completely as it is. One has left decorations and machines and displayed them in order from a distance to make an agreeable effect. And yet one hides from your view the wheels and the counterweights which make these movements." The second passage extends this treatment such that it addresses the dilemma faced by philosophers who, when not being able to identify the mechanics of nature, start to invent and attribute forces to the specific elements within nature. For the philosophers, the difficulty is, and I quote, "It is in the machines that nature presents to our eyes chords and strings which are perfectly well hidden, and they are so well hidden that one has for a long time guessed at the causes of the movements of the universe." So there are chords pulling the universe, but they're hidden, so we guess at what they are. Rather than succumbing to what for Fontenelle would be pointless speculation, the truth of nature lies in the recognition that what occurs to the eye is the effect of a mechanical operation sustained by weights and measures, in the same way that the staging of the opera depends upon a series of mechanical operations that are not on view. Not only does this present the terms in which the relationship between nature, understood as that which is present to the eye, and the forces of nature should be comprehended, it sets in play the structure of the relation between nature and machine. That connection is stated in the following terms, and I quote, "The universe is as large as a watch is small, and that everything is conducted in both by regular movements which depend on the arrangement of parts. So the universe is as large as a watch is small. So the analogy is between the universe and the watch. And it's fascinating, these philosophers keep returning to the analogy of the watch. The passage provides the interpretive frame in which to develop an understanding of the earlier passages. The problem identified by Fontenelle, and therefore that which gives rise to the errors made by philosophers, concerns the conclusions they draw from having to provide an account of what cannot be seen, given that what cannot be seen has a determining effect on what is. The movement staged by the analogy sets the scene precisely because the difference between the universe and the watch is merely a difference thought on the level of quantity. In other words, it's a difference thought on the level of scale. Again, if you think about this in architectural terms, what is being staged here is precisely the problem of the model. What is the relationship between the model and an envisaged building? Is it simply thought on the level of scale? And if it's not thought on the level of scale, how does one think the relationship between them? In other words, if the model is merely a small version of that which will one day be very large, if that's the case, it's simply a matter of pumping it up. And one is Fontenelle, one is a late 17th century French philosopher, which is a cool thing to be. But if it's not that, and it isn't, but if it's not that, then the theoretical challenge, but it's an experimental challenge within on the level of design, is how do you understand the difference between the model and that which the model envisages? How does one think that difference? Equally, the point concerns the line, the drawing. If the drawing is merely that which differs on the level of scale from the model, such that the drawing is a two-dimensional instance of that which eventually will have three dimensions, and that's all the difference is, then moving from one to the other is unproblematic. If it's not that, if it's not mere scale, then how is the difference to be thought? And so the analogy with the watch, as it were, is staging the problem of the model in architecture. Now, the movement staged by the analogy sets the scene precisely because the difference, as I've said, between the universe and the watch is merely that of quantity, merely that of scale. If it were possible to shrink the world such that it were no more than the size of a watch, then explanations of the work of nature and those of the mechanics of nature would be identical to the explanations of the operation of the watch. The difference presented in terms of quantity presupposes two elements. The first pertains to the eye, and the second to representation. In the first, once the distinction between the universe and the clock is thought in terms of scale, then there will be a position from which the totality of each can come into view. In one case, the view is defined by the eye, the watch. In another, by theory. In other words, a notion of architectural theory or theory which will recall a commitment, albeit one that in the end is false, but a commitment to the singularity of view. The eye and theory would hence combine, insofar as both are given within a temporality of the instant. There will be an image in which the detail of each could be presented such that as it is. And it's this image that opens up the field of representation. Moreover, it's this image which, when we project an image on a screen, we come to understand as representational, with all that that entails. Now, in drawing together Descartes and Fontenelle in the way I have, I've tried to indicate that two philosophers in conflict, usually, in the end come down to posing a specific problem. In the end, the conception of line and of drawing that emerges from, and hence the analogy with the machine and the relationship between parts, that emerges from analysis of their text, is simply the mechanical view where each thing presented is of the same status at the same time. There cannot be the inscription of potential. And therefore the problems I merely adumbrated before cannot be thought in these terms. Now, given that they can't be thought in these terms, given that the problem of if the relationship between model and building is not that of scale, not that given by the structure of representation, then how is it to be thought? Given that this mode of philosophical thinking is inadequate, where does one go? How do we begin to address this as a theoretical problem? I now have a rather dense page on Hegel. Indulge me. Hegel too, like all these guys, was obsessed with the problem of points, lines, planes and space. And he had this marvellous idea, and whenever I teach Hegel to undergraduates, to explain Hegel easily, you just take this bit from the philosophy of nature. He says, look, you have space as purely continuous, and you have a point in space. Well, a point in space is necessarily discrete, and because of that, the point is the negation of space. And yet space contains its own negation, which in sum gives you a lot of Hegel very quickly. And I want to just develop this question of the point. It's what emerges from Hegel so interesting is how the point is thought philosophically. Space as the absolutely continuous. If you think of space as absolutely continuous, it both refuses specificity, because it's absolutely continuous, and yet demands it, because things take place in space. It refuses it precisely because space has to maintain itself as undifferentiated, and thus as continuous. Space demands particularity, yet, in order that it have the interiority that defines delimited spatial locations. As such, for Hegel, the point functions, as I've already said, as the negation of space. Space, as it were, contains its own negation. The opening engagement with the point in the philosophy of nature recalls the definition given in Hegel's logic of the point as what he calls being for self. Now, I'll give you this definition and I'll step back and explain it. I'd quote, being for self as a reference to itself is pure immediacy. As a reference of the negative to itself, it is as self-subsistent, it is the one. The unit, being without distinction in itself, thus excludes the other from itself. Now what this means is it's an argument for the notion of the point as the site of pure simplicity. The point can never be other than purely itself. Now part of what is involved in this formulation is that unity, understood here as the point, is self-defined. The point is present as a simple singularity. Within the confines of Hegelian logic, it is the combination of space as that which incorporates its own negation, the point as the negation of pure continuity, that in part defines the concept of space. While this further defines space, what it does at the same time is open up the question of why it is that the point, while spatial, insofar as it is a point in space, given as this, why does it nonetheless lack spatiality? How do you move from a point to spatiality? The force of the question means that there has to be that move in which the negation of space, the point, acquires spatiality. To the extent that the definition of the point as simple being for self, to the extent this is maintained, then it cannot work, the point cannot work, as the site of the incorporation of lines, be those lines virtual or actual. It is only in what for Hegel becomes the spatializing of the point that it contain that which marks space, namely continuity. It is thus that the spatiality of the point is the line. In Hegel's term, the line is the point existing outside of itself, that is, relating itself to space, and the plane similarly is the line existing outside of itself. Within the complex relationship staged by this formulation, there resides not just the elements of Hegelian logic, the movement to positivity through negation, nor just the interrelationship between point, line and plane, but the further opening out of space into time. And it's a key element to me that we talk about space and we talk about time, and we keep forgetting that the problem that emerges is how do we think their relationship? Now, I indicated earlier that I think that spacing is always already timed. Hegel is interesting in this regard, in that he is opposing a notion of space and time. He wants to see the idea of time emerging out of space. And if you think that a point moves to a line in its moving outside of itself, if one takes seriously the movement outside of itself, that movement is already timed. In other words, that the opening up of space and time resists simple addition. Time does not emerge by its having added to space. The line and the place bring with them what could be called the side-by-sidedness of space, that is, the juxtaposition of pure coordinates. And these initially defy temporal organization. Time and space differ in terms of how they are recognized. Space can be confronted both as in terms of objectivity and subjectivity. Time, however, does not lend itself to such a description. The reason for this, for Hegel, is that time involves, and I quote him, the same principle as the I equals I of pure self-consciousness. What that means is that time, like the I, the ich, is pure being within itself, as he puts it, as sheer coming out of itself. In other words, what the I is the process of its being. What time is the process of its being. What is meant by this is that time, as with the I, is this movement. In other words, time is present as a mode of being whose existence is determined by its attempts to realize itself outside of itself. Time, therefore, emerges from the spatialization of the line as pure becoming. Points, lines, and places, for Hegel, are not defined, points, lines, and planes are not defined in terms of each other. In other words, the line does not consist of points. The relationship necessitates recourse to the logic of negation and ultimately to the concept. However, the crucial point here is not the incorporation of these elements into a complex relation, but the necessity to hold the line and the point apart. Even if a line is not to consist of points, the point only extends to the line through negation. Any movement back the other way from line to point has to be expressed in a similar way. The line works towards the plane, though equally the recourse back to the point is through the negation of the line. The simplicity of the point is that it comes to be defined in terms of a simple set of coordinates that are self-subsistent. The point cannot be defined in terms of a distinction between virtual and actual intersections that establish the point as a site of relations. Relationality, as forming the points and original conditions, needs to maintain a distinction between the virtual and the actual. While it is right to argue that the line is not a simple combination of points, what can never be precluded is that the point is itself the convergence of lines, in the precise sense that the point, while simple, is the locus of the infinity of angles created by the lines that converge on and as the point. With such a possibility, the point moves from the possibility of pure being for self to the site of simplicity defined in terms of an ineliminable multiplicity. The point is the site of the convergence of the infinity of angles created by the lines constituting that point. It is with the possibility that the point and the line move from a location within an ontology of temporality and representation on the one hand, and simple being for self on the other, that it becomes possible to rethink line and point in terms of multiplicity. This redefinition is towards Leibniz, the final part, which I called an infinity of angles. These are notes. The Leibnizian version of this question of the redefinition of the line is found, for example, in the distinction drawn between a certain conception of an assemblage and a substance having what he describes as true unity. The example of the assemblage is again the clock. That this time the clock is taken away from having a positive value and is given a different value. With the clock, all of its parts are present in one and the same time. No matter how complex the internal mechanism may be, it is only a clock and thus an assemblage of parts. This is, if you like, precisely the problem that we saw emerge with Descartes and Fontenelle. The impossibility of thinking complexity. All we have is complexity as addition, a number of interrelated parts. No matter how complex the internal mechanism may be, it is only a clock, and thus this assemblage. Now, the passage in question concerns Leibniz's attempt to differentiate between a genuine unity and an assemblage. The context concerns the distinction between a clock and an animal. He writes, "The unity of a clock is other than, in my work, that of an animal. It can be a substance, the animal can be a substance with a true unity, as I would call the moi en nous, the I in ourselves, rather than a clock, which is nothing other than an assemblage." Now, what he's doing, and as you'll see, is introducing into this distinction between a true unity and an assemblage, a notion that a unity is from the start a multiplicity, where that notion of multiplicity is fundamentally different from an assemblage, which is a multiple of parts. So it's a new way of thinking multiplicity that's outside that of addition. Moving from the machine towards this notion of multiplicity and unity is not on its own a theological turn. Rather, and more importantly, it is to inscribe an ontology of movement and process as defining substance, such that its constituent parts continue to be given or individuated within the unfolding of substance itself, which occurs within and as the condition for the unfolding of time. The form of instance of this unfolding are described by Leibniz in the Nouveaux Essays as little perceptions. Now, what is emerging here are two distinct senses of multiplicity, and I want to pursue these. The setting in which this pursuit has to be taken up is one given by the proposition that substance, rather than being static and fixed, is defined by, in Latin the word is vis, in English the word is force, by movement, by process. To use the formulation given by Leibniz, a substance is un être capable d'action, a being capable of action, and that capability and that action defines substance. Therefore, movement and the capacity for movement is there from the very start. It's written in. While in the Cartesian sense, that capacity for movement is of necessity written out. And what becomes interesting is, how does one draw a line that contains a capacity of action, a capacity for movement? How does one draw a line that is at the same time process as much as it is the drawing of a line? There is therefore an ineliminable actative pertaining to action, actative dimension that accounts for the mode of being proper to simple unity in Leibniz. Of the many possible passages that could be used to take up the detail of the location of multiplicity in unity, as inextricably bound up with an ontology of process of becoming, two will have to suffice. The first occurs in a letter to Arnaud, written in 1687, and the second from this text, The Principles. The passages in question are the following. Almost there. First is this. It's the machine. All machines suppose some substance in the pieces of which they are made, and there is not a multiple without true unities. And then he goes on in the same passage to say that being is diversified, has variety, diversity, only by degree. There are always accents of being. I'll come back to that. The passage from the Principles opens up a similar domain of inquiry concerning how simplicity is to be understood. He said, the simplicity of a substance does not restrict the multiplicity of modifications which ought to be found together in this simple substance. And they ought to consist in the variety of relations to things which are outside. And then the key point. It is as a point. C'est comme un point. As a point. All simple as it is, in this point se trouve, is found an infinity of angles, formed by the lines which concur there. The significant moment in the letter is the relationship between the claim that diversification, perhaps difference, is only a matter of accent, and therefore the implicit reciprocity this gives between being and unity, where both are always already multiple. What this allows for is that the changes within simple substance, the monad, the different perceptions, the different states in which there is consciousness of those perceptions, are part of that unity. The point becomes clear when Leibniz claims, as you will continue to claim, that the plural always supposes the singular. In other words, that singularity has its condition of possibility on an ineliminable plurality. What has to be taken up, of course, which I will sketch and then stop, is how plurality and singularity are being thought in this formulation. The significant elements from the passages I've read out concerns the way in which that which is simple can reflect a plurality of relations that are external to and yet which are unfolding within simplicity. So the simple is always already plural from the start. As a virtual claim and as an actual claim, it will always have specificity, but that specificity will reunite into further specificities because of the virtuality of the point. Once the question is asked concerning how the plurality in question is to be understood, then the answer is provided by the formulation itself. Not only is the conception of variety given, its meaning is further expanded by the use of the analogy. In regards to the first element, Leibniz's formulation is precise. Multiplicity, that which makes up the multiple, is that they must consist in the variety of relations to things which are outside. Difference, therefore, is explicable in terms of variety. The point exists because of a play of lines constituting it as point. The analogy reinforces this position. As I said, it is as a point, as simple as it is, in which is found an infinity of angles formed by the lines which occur there. The point, while simple, is the locus where a potential infinity of angles is found. While the analogy allows for an understanding of a specific conception of multiplicity and unity, what needs to be incorporated is the explication of multiplicity as positioned within an ontology of process, and thus a conception of substance as force, as movement. The way of examining this is by returning to Leibniz's remarks addressed to Monsieur Fauchet. The passage in question will provide a dramatic way of concluding. By dramatic, I mean very quick. After distinguishing between abstract things and actual things, the actual is defined in the following terms. In actual substantial things, the all is a result of simple substances or of real multiple unities. The challenge here is the incorporation of the simple as already the presence of multiplicity. This will necessitate recourse to Leibniz's distinction between the virtual and the actual. Extension or space, and therefore line, points, surfaces, planes, are what he calls rapports d'ordre, systems of relations. Rapport de coexistence, relations of coexistence, and those relations are always of actual and possible, of virtual and actual existences. Therefore, there is no essential quality to points, lines, surfaces, extension or space outside of relationality. Relationality delimits actual existence, and yet the actual is not one. What this means, of course, is that actual existence cannot be positioned as a representation. It is positioned as a specific play of forces at a specific time, which will become another relational system at another point in time. The relationship, therefore, is always between a virtual and actual existence, Leibniz's terms. In my terms, that can be written by saying that what is always being staged is a relationship between material presence and immateriality, where the play of the immaterial and the material configure a set of relations that pertain at a particular time. They represent that nothing outside of themselves. They merely stage a particular play of forces, a particular set of relations. And once one begins to link a geometry to that, it then becomes possible to talk about actual relations, as I've said, as to use Nietzsche's formulation, this play of forces. To that extent, we have a drawing of lines. A drawing of lines that represents nothing, but is itself simply this play of forces. What that then generates is a question. How does one move from these drawn lines to that of which these lines are a drawing? Given that, it can no longer be claimed that the that of which the drawing is a drawing is represented by the drawing. And that seems to me to be the theoretical problem posed by the necessity within architecture for the drawing of lines. Thank you.
Could we have some questions? Yeah.
Andrew, I want to raise a question about time, temporality, and drawings. I guess the question is, you described on raising the question about time and temporality of drawings, you gave the illustration of the wife drawing the outline of her warrior. I suppose I'm interested in how architects operate with drawings, and whether they're simply representing something that's already given, or whether they're representing something that is to come in a way, and whether the image for architects of representation is a sort of wish image for the future. Certainly, Walter Benjamin's view of drawings of animals and caves were precisely the notion that they were to conjure up those animals for the future. I'm just wondering whether what the architectural imagination doesn't do is operate on those lines in a vaguely sort of magical way with a view to the future as a possible realization, so the image becomes some sort of wish image.
Well,
when you see the representation in the light of something like voodoo models that are somehow invested in some potential in some sort of way, there is another way of kind of looking at that sort of world of lines as something that can be animated by the architectural imagination with a view towards the future.
yeah, I'm in some sense I have lots of equivocations all the way through with the way that's formulated, but leaving those to one side, clearly, all you're doing is, with great respect, is restating the problem I finished with and began with. The question is, if a drawing envisages a future, how do you understand the relationship between the drawing and the future? And that, to my mind, is the nature of the problem. Rather than, so if you accept that as the question, then what I'm saying, or what I'm suggesting, is that what becomes productive is to not see the drawing as the presentation of an envisaged future, but to continue to pose as a theoretical problem how the relationship between design understood as an activity and building understood as an activity, how that relationship is itself thought. Clearly, most architectural drawings envisage a future. Even if they're pure experimentation, they envisage some notion of a future possibility. The interesting question is how one understands that relationship. And the example of the interesting example from Pliny that I alluded to was that in some sense the drawing is completed and finished and over when the guy comes back and stands in the outline. So that it's the drawing of his shadow, as you know. So when he comes back and stands in this space, the drawing is completed. And what this gives you is a notion of drawing as envisaging a state of affairs that will be completed. So you can then say the drawing is accurate because what it envisaged has now been done. What interests me far more is holding to, I suppose, a far more incomplete, I suppose, conception of drawing, and to that extent allowing drawing a different life. So the future is always to be negotiated. The question is how that negotiation is to be understood.
That's a good question. I mean, can I sort of put to it a sort of slightly Hegelian question, which is you ask, what the fit is between the two, and I guess for Hegel, the fit takes place through the act of recognition of the fit. That is, there doesn't actually have to be ontologically some fit, except that there is the recognition of one. I mean, that's like the first part of the question. And the second part is what you say about lines and their respective drawing about all lines in drawing, potentially, or is it, following on from the Pliny, subjected to a regime of what you might call the outline?
Well, let's start with the second part first. Is that this is one of the, I mean, it seems to the extent that I've got this, it seems to be one of the great problems, is that you can take a still life painting. This is as being a representation of, I know, let's call it, Mont Saint-Victoire, for argument's sake, and go to Mont Saint-Victoire and say, gosh, this is a good painting of that. In other words, you're judging the work in terms of a relationship between the internal and the external. And therefore you're using a category of internal-external relationships, thought in part in terms of a representation, to judge what is ostensibly a representation. Now that's what you can then do is say, but it seems to me that if what's at stake here is a rethinking of that very mode of interpretive activity, then while Cézanne's painting is ostensibly of Mont Saint-Victoire, what is more interesting is to ask the question of how it works as a painting in painting this, namely the drawing of lines within it, and in differentiating bands of colour, are, if you like, that which effect bring about representation. So representation is an after effect of the addition of colours and the separating of those colours by the drawing of lines. In Cézanne, I think this is even more acutely present in some of the studies he did for the bathers, where the difference between the paints applied at one angle for the outline, background, another angle for the bathers, and all that separates them is the drawing of a black line. Now, it's the drawing of this line which, as it were, doesn't represent anything, but is the condition of possibility for this painting being a representation. In other words, one can take two things that are ostensibly representational, a mode of interpretation that is not governed by internal-external relations, and therefore doesn't have to see them as representations. Now, on the other hand, there is that gesture and someone says, look, from the very beginning, this is not representational. And that therefore a certain notion of the diagram in architecture, though equally I would add the American painter Richard Diebenkorn's attempt to capture the urban through the drawing of bands of colour with lines separating the colour is not an attempt to represent at all. It's an attempt to, as it were, draw a state of affairs that allows for representations to be attributed to it, but is itself not representational. So if you were to interpret it that way, you would have misunderstood it from the very start. So then there are at least two ways of dealing with how it is that one begins to interpret lines. The first part of the question, I've forgotten. The outline. Well, is this a question about the outline and the sketch and something that has a provisional nature, rather than something that attempts to be more than that? Because one of the things I find in thinking about drawing is the tentative nature of drawings and the tentative nature of sketches. And the Cézanne example is a very good one, is where all the provisional studies prior to the painting of the bathers. I mean, how do you understand those? And are they, as it were, outlines, or can one attribute some status to them independently? I'm not sure.
Sorry, Bob.
Can we take a case where there is no line actually drawn? I'm thinking of Moholy-Nagy's light machine, where light is passed across an automaton. With various, in Moholy-Nagy's light.
Sorry, can you turn the bottom on?
This one.
It is on.
It's not close.
Oh. Can you tell me, in the case of Moholy-Nagy's light machine, where there is no representation as far as I know, but light simply passes through a moving object, an automaton, onto a screen. If you then look at the resulting shadows on the other side of the screen, you get a marvelous effect of magic on a movement which is purely, in a sense, decorative, but which is achieved through the suppression of information. If you go around to the front and see how the light creates those patterns by falling on the moving machine, there is no magic and there's no particular interest. So my question is to do with the information that's involved between the representation of by a diagram and something beyond. If one leaves out the intention to represent, is it not information that's missing?
I'm not sure. Again, I'm not sure that I'm fully, probably me, grasping the point that you're making. I mean, what I'm simply suggesting here is allowing for the drawing. I mean, I'm not sure quite how to fit this example into what I've been trying to argue. That's all. I mean, that's why I'm hesitant, because I'm not quite sure how to incorporate it. The question of information is that if you have, I mean, again, let's pose it as a very boring question. How do you move from a drawing or a diagram to plan and section? You do that by making a decision. And that decision constitutes how you understand, how the diagram or the drawing is to have been understood. Okay? So to that extent, that after the event of act of constitution, as it were, attributes to something a specific quality. Now, what is interesting, I suppose, in the development of, especially the use of computers, is how one begins to understand the nature of that decision. It could be a simple, je, in which I freeze it now, that's my decision. I render it, etc., plan and section, etc., Another decision could be purely, an act of spontaneity. The question is of information is that at a certain point it's only with this decision, and it's interesting to me that this decision, as it were, turns retroactively the drawing or the diagram into something about which one can make a judgment. But that decision is then the attribution to the line or the drawing of information that was merely a virtual possibility. So what I'm, I guess, wanting to argue, as I think about it, is that information is a virtual possibility in any line, but the important point is that it is only at a certain moment that that information, and therefore the decision, is actualized. And therefore the question can always be, because it's a decision, why couldn't it have been such and such? And the very capacity to ask that question both reinforces the fact that the decision was the attribution of information, that this is how I'm understanding this bit of this relationship between these two lines, because I've decided to do this with it, and that attributes them a quality that was only virtually present before. And therefore they then come to represent, but prior to that they didn't. So the information is an after the event activity. And so it will have been the case that given a certain state of affairs, a virtual possibility is actualized. Now that, I think, that generates a different conception of the activity of, on a theoretical level, I suppose, of thinking through the process of design than that which would be governed by, eurythmy and symmetry from the very start.
Gustav.
Could you draw some connections with some of your key points to Italian futurism? You were concerned with issues of time, movement, and no doubt philosophy.
Not straightforwardly, but I suppose the only connection I'm wanting to make is I'm trying to make complicated the easy rush to analogy with machines, and and part of that, making that complicated, is to say that we can't judge all analogies with machines in the same way, and that part of what a Leibniz is doing, as opposed to a Descartes or a Fontenelle or whoever, is that there is a different, that analogy has an importantly different status. Now, I don't know sufficient about Italian futurism to know how to answer properly, except to say that clearly the analogy with machines figures there. And all I would say as a word of caution is that one can't think that all analogies with machines have the same status.
Okay, I think then, Hannah.
Just want to ask one quick question. It seems as though, depending on the kind of drawings that one is doing, we're going from the world which is covering cognitive information to that which might be representational. And I know that this description might not be exactly, these words might not mean exactly the same thing to everybody, but if we say that some kinds of diagrams do possess dimensions, for example, as opposed to others, which might, say in the case of futurists, might be an effect. Therefore, we're talking about degrees of their cognitive and representational order or role. And in that sense, don't we then have to get into a discussion of where the automaton, say, when it's used in the theater versus when it is in the watch, goes between these two worlds, where if one is a closed world of cognitive information, and the other opens up to the world of representation, which any sketch might be able to do.
Well, I mean, again, I think precisely what I'm doing is trying to do something like that by, as I said in the earlier answer, was by complicating the analogies. The point of Descartes and Fontenelle was that the analogy with the machine was simply that of provided you with a series of parts moving, and you could lift off the top and watch it all operate, like a model, quite simply, and you could lift off the top and see how things operated. And even things you couldn't see, you knew had the same quality as things that you could see. And what I was doing was, in some sense, saying, look, that's certainly one way of understanding the analogy with the machine. The other analogy with the machine, which comes from Leibniz, is a way of understanding an assemblage that is no longer understood straightforwardly in terms of things which are structured by temporal simultaneity. Now, that was part of the project. Now, how that relates to the distinction between the cognitive and the representational is itself already a problem, and it comes out very interestingly with the problem of I mean, take the word cognitive quite literally, and that's of mapping of neural networks. I mean, one of the interesting things in drawing in the realm of philosophy of psychology and the fascination with neural networks is that academic articles about them always contain drawings in which you'll have a drawing of a neural network. So you actually have a drawing of cognition. Now, I'm just allowing the cognitive to work straightforwardly. And it seems to me that no matter what you do, you come back to the same problem. Namely that when you have all these little dots with lines running between them, the question that you ask of them is, well, how do I understand that? How do I understand the drawing of cognition, let alone worrying about the cognitive quality of something, which is its ideational quality, its ideas, etc., and the difference between that and a representation? What if you actually drew cognition itself? And it seems the moment you begin to draw, especially that which is delimited by process, you have the general theoretico-philosophico problem I've tried to identify from the very start, namely what status to attribute to the drawing. So drawings of neural networks have to be, on one level, experimentations that have to be thought experiments. So they're purely cognitive. Here is a possible way of drawing this. Don't think for a moment that it is representational. It captures the ideational quality of that which it's actually trying to describe, namely a relationship between neurons. So one can't escape the general problem of drawing by moving from one realm to the other, because as soon as you allow for that sort of distinction, you have to say, well, how is cognition itself present in something?
Can I just ask one last question, because it kind of intrigued me all the way through. I mean, essentially one element of the argument is that the simple line kind of contains this potential complexity, only when, as it were, you make time a condition of the space of the line, that in a sense it has a kind of, in Aristotelian sense, it has a sort of potential.
Yes.
I was wondering if it's always in favour of complexity, or whether there mightn't be kind of processes, I don't know what you call them, of entropy, as it were, when it would work exactly the other way around.
Well, again, very good question. I seem to be, I'm not on the defensive, but I was feeling myself saying, well, it depends what you mean by complexity. And it came out very interestingly in a seminar I'm involved in, where we were looking, and we are indeed looking, at the Farnsworth House within a tradition of minimalism. And one of the questions that came up with the Farnsworth House was the extent to which it was literal minimalism. And so it was pure simplicity. And whether there is actually a more complex notion of minimalism. One in which, and it's not my formulation, it was one used by one of the wonderful students, was just to say that you could have a notion of complex minimalism where the avoidance of ornaments was incorporated into the structure itself. And we were shown some slides to indicate how the avoidance of ornaments could be part of the minimal. Now, it seems to me at a certain point then that if you take take minimalism, as it were, as this attempt to realize the objectivity of the object, as pure simplicity, it seems to me that there is a certain strategy of doing it that allows the purely simple to always be more complex than pure simplicity. And so the empirical examples will allow one to say, look, there is no such thing as the desire for pure simplicity other than it has presence as a desire. On a philosophical or theoretical level, I think that at a certain point, the idea of entropy would be, and it's an interesting problem, would I think be, and I'm not sure the extent to which I'm committed to this, but I'll say it anyway, would be an inappropriate term. And the reason why is, within this argument, and therefore it's probably the right term to have raised, and that is that what I'm trying to suggest always is that anything that is simple, in bearing an ineliminable complexity that gives it, where that complexity gives simplicity its condition of possibility. So the finite is always conditioned by an ineliminable infinite, which is the structure of the decision. The decision is that it could always have been otherwise. So the entropy would only emerge in a sort of resignation in the face of a potential future not to continue. And that would be a very interesting way of, and you're probably all experiencing this, to begin to think philosophically about boredom. Would be at that moment in which the potential future is actually refused. Not through an act of negation or an act of epistemological claim of its being false, but just through an act of boredom. And so it seems to me that there is something interesting in the possibility of refusing that which is always there, I would want to argue, in potentia, which would be, I guess, philosophical entropy, which would be boredom. I guess.
Okay. I think we should finish there. Andrew, thank you very much indeed. And please do join us